I'm Michael McHugh. I'm going to talk about the power of the standard library. I'm not very good at naming talks, but that's what it is. I work here at Urban Airship, or here in Portland at Urban Airship. This is my first talk, so we'll see how it goes. I use quite a few languages, Python, Java, and JavaScript at work. At home, I use C and now C# some. I've done a bunch in Go, but hey, so yeah, I use a bunch of different languages, Python, JavaScript, and Java at work, and C and C# at home, and then Go all the time as well. But whenever I really want to get something done really quickly, I use Python. The reasons I generally turn to Python is it's an incredibly expressive language. You can do a lot with it, and with a very small amount of code. I'm very familiar with it. It's probably the language I'm most familiar with. I've been using it for probably close to a decade now. And obviously because there's a lot of functionality that's just built right into it. And this talk is going to be about chatbots, and games. The intention of this talk was to say, okay, what can I do using nothing but the standard library? And so what I ended up building was an IRC bot that connects to a channel, and it will let everyone in the channel kind of play Cards Against Humanity or Apples to Apples or something like that. And it uses no third-party modules. It's just built-ins, language syntax, and the standard library. So I procrastinate a little bit. The bot was written, I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but that is Thursday, October 8th at 8 p.m. when I started writing the bot. Took me about 3.5 hours, so that kind of shows Python's pretty good. The first thing we're going to do when you need to talk to IRC is you need to talk over the network. So first thing we're going to do is import socket. The IRC protocol, luckily, is pretty simple. It's a text-based protocol. It's not binary. Sockets can sometimes get kind of hairy, but a lot of that comes in the binary protocol in the wire format. For IRC, we're just going to send text commands down the wire, and as you'll see later, it's pretty easy to do, but we'll give a very, very brief overview of the IRC protocol as I understand it. I understand it mostly from some quick Google searches and then connecting to a locally running IRC server, and just hitting it with things and seeing what it said. So the amount of stuff that I actually covered is just enough so that stuff stopped breaking. So the first thing is the user command. You have to send this, and it's like, hey, this is my username, this is my full name, something, something. I think there's a 0 and a star in there. And that's to authenticate with the server. Then you have the nick command, and that says, hey, this is my nickname, this is what everyone's going to see me as on the server. There's a ping and a pong. The server will ping you with some message. The client has to respond with a pong. So that's, if you haven't been doing anything, it's just the server's way to know that you're still there and connected. Then there's join. That's what you use to join a channel. It's also what the server will send to you when someone else joins a channel that you're a member of. And there's the priv message, private message. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It's basically any message. It's a private message coming from a user, coming from a channel, or it's what you use to send a message to a user or to a channel. So it does kind of all of the messaging that I saw anyway. So this is the first part of the bot. The very first thing it does is going to take you pass in a host and a name, and then it will create a socket. There are these magical constants in the socket module that tell it how to create it. AF INET is address family internet. It's for an IP version 4. AF INET 6 is for IPv6. There's other things. And then sock stream is TCP. So then once you've created that socket, you have the socket object, and then you just connect it to a host, the host that we passed in, which in my case was localhost, and the 6667 is a pretty common default IRC port. Once you've connected, all you have to do is say send, and there's the two commands I mentioned before, using some string formatting, throwing the name in there twice, because that's what they wanted, and then that 0 and the star. I don't really know what those do, but it didn't work if I didn't put them there. And then nick, so that everyone will know what your name is. And then to listen, all you do is you just have this infinite loop, and you do socket.receive. The thing you pass into it is the buffer size. You say, give me the message. If it's more than 1024, in this case, 1 kilobyte, only give me the first 1 kilobyte. That's so you don't run out of memory trying to read a giant message. And then we just print it so that we can see what's going on. We will create a bot passing in localhost and the name bot. And this is what came up in my terminal when I ran it, which is the IRC package I installed on my machine, spitting out a bunch of stuff like, I don't know, I'm special and fearsome and a whole bunch of congrats. Anyway, but it connected, so that was good for me. The last couple messages that I talked about, we'll just kind of wrap those in helper methods on the class. So there's the join. All it's saying is, okay, it'll join, pass in a channel, and it just sends that down the socket. And then for message, the same thing, except you need to give it a recipient, which, as I mentioned, can either be another user on the server, or it can be a channel. Oh, yeah, okay. So then once I instantiated the bot, I ran those two helpers and said, okay, join the channel, then send a message. But it didn't work. And the reason for that was, if you remember when we did that receive loop, it was just an infinite loop constantly sitting there and receiving. Unfortunately, that meant it could never get past that down to my join channel and send a message, so we're going to have to try something else. For that, we're going to use threads. Python has, in my opinion, a very wonderfully easy to use implementation of threads. They're super, super simple to actually start up and run. There are some caveats that some of you might know of. The big one being there's this thing called the global interpreter lock, which is why when anyone mentions threads in Python, it's like, oh, don't use them because they're useless, which is sad because the threading module is so easy to use. It's also kind of not true. There's plenty of things you can use threads for. You don't have to worry about the global interpreter lock. In this particular case, it's a perfect example because we're just in this one thread, we're going to be waiting on I/O. The global interpreter lock, in most cases, gets released when you're doing I/O. So it can go and do other things while you're waiting for I/O. So, like I said, this is all you need to do, and that middle one isn't even necessarily needed. I put it there. It's when you create the thread, you just say pass it in a target. In this case, the self_listen was that while loop I showed you before, just pulled out and put into a method. So we say, okay, create me a thread. The target of the thread is going to be this method. Set it to a daemon because I didn't want to have to deal with like starting and stopping the thread. So it's like when the main thread dies, even if this is still running, the process will exit anyway. And then you just say thread.start. That's all you need to do to get a thread running, which is why if people have tried threading in other languages like C or something like that, it's super nice to use. So then after I did the join a channel, send a message, now that it's no longer blocked, it's just going to quit immediately. To prove that it's actually like sending messages and then doing a thing, use time.sleep. That just says, hey, wait for 10 seconds, block for 10 seconds, and don't do anything. So that is in my IRC client. You can see my bot joined, it said hello, it waited 10 seconds, and then it left. And it left because the thread died. The main thread died, so the thing that was listening to it disappeared as well. So another thing that you do a lot in Python and in a lot of programming is string manipulation. Happens pretty much in every program I've ever run or written. I've had to do some kind of string manipulation. String manipulation isn't an import. It's not a module in the standard library, but strings are built in and they're part of the standard library, so it kind of counts. There's a bunch of string helpers that we're going to be using. First one is strip. It will kind of take off white space at the beginning and end. There's L strip and R strip, which is left and right, if you only want to take off white space from one side or the other. This is useful because the IRC messages all come down with new lines at the end, so I don't want to have to deal with that, so I just tell it to strip. There's starts with, there's also ends with. This is probably what it sounds like. You pass it a string and you say, hey, does this string start with this string? And if it does, it will say true. If it doesn't, it will return false. Split, you say, okay, take this string and split it. This is the character, character or characters I want you to split it on. Optionally, you can also tell it the number of times to split. That'll return a tuple of the things that were split. And because strings are just sequences in Python, you can do all the things you normally can with sequences and like lists. You can index them and you can slice them, so you can take substrings just by using normal slicing. And then, as I already used a little bit, there's the format method. There's also string interpolation, but I prefer to use format. There's a couple different ways you can do that. You can pass in positional arguments, you can pass in dictionary or named arguments, or in the case that most of these that I've been using, you can just kind of pass in the positional arguments, and without anything in the braces in the string, it will just take them in order. So this is what I did to parse the IRC messages that are coming down from the server. The messages in IRC are kind of structured. They can have a source at the beginning. If they do, they'll start with that colon, and then it'll have like a username and then a exclamation point and then some host name data. So, but that's optional. So the first thing we do is say, okay, does the message start with a colon? If it does, then we're going to need to split out the source from the rest of the message. So we'll say, okay, grab everything except the first character. So we'll take off that colon, split on the first space you find. And then we'll assign that to the source and the command message. We'll then take the user out of the source because, like I said, it's divided by an exclamation point. So we will grab the first piece after from the split of source, and that's our user. If we didn't have a colon, then we didn't have a source, so we don't have a user. So user gets assigned to a none, and the whole message is just the command message. And then everything is space delimited until you hit another colon, which then says, okay, read everything else as this an argument. So again, we'll find the first space split on that. So the first one will be the command. Everything after that is the arguments. And then we'll just do a little print saying, hey, we got a command from someone. These are the arguments they passed. And that's what it looks like. If you can read that, I'm not sure. But it says there like command join from McHugh, which was me when my bot was running looking at the server. So it saw me join the channel. I sent a message to the channel, then I sent a message to the bot, and then there's that ping message because nothing was happening for a little while. Okay, so then another thing in Python, not part of the standard library, but it's just part of the syntax of the language, but I find it helps me be really productive, so I'm going to say it counts too. So the first thing we need to do is define some handlers. So that's what I did here. So there, when you want to send a pong, it's the same thing we saw before with the join and the private message. It just says, hey, except it has a source and a message because that's what all of our handlers are going to read. And then there's this private message, which was the other one that we're going to get from the server. And that will do the thing. So it'll split looking for the a space and colon, because that will say that the command starts with private message space and then a colon for the rest of the message. So we'll split it, find everything after that, and then we're saying if the message starts with an exclamation point, then we'll assume that that's a command that we want our bot to do something with, just because that seems to be pretty standard in IRC bots, is you start with an exclamation point and then give it your command. Then we just have this dictionary, so because functions are first-class objects, we can just assign them to variables or references. So we have this IRC handlers. We say, okay, whenever we see a ping, we want it to just run the pong method. Whenever we see this private message, we will run the self.privateMessage method. And that's here where we see it. We say, okay, now that we've got this command, if that command exists in our handlers, then just call the function straight out of the dictionary, because first-class functions are great. And you'll pass in the user and the arguments that we parsed out in the previous slides. And then we're going to talk about files and JSON. Files are built in, so you don't have to import them into a module. The open command is just a built-in command. JSON is a module, so you import that. File I/O is incredibly important in pretty much everything. And again, Python makes it super, super easy, which is why one of the many reasons I love the language. And JSON is just super convenient because it's hand editable, so people can read it and see it. So we're going to use that to create a file with some JSON in it, and we'll use that to configure and initialize the bot. So the first thing you do is you just, like I said, you run this open command and pass it a file path. There's other options. Another optional argument, you can pass it the mode. And if you don't pass it a mode, the default is just read. Otherwise, you can have things like write, or you can tell it you want, this is a binary file. So in this case, we just want read, so I don't pass an argument at all. Also, I'm not going to show it on the slides for space, but you should always close your file handles when you're done with them. When you're reading, it's not as big a deal. Writing, it's a much bigger deal, because if you don't close them, they won't flush. There's a context manager that'll help with files as well. You can just say with open as some variable, and then everything in there will have access to that variable in that block. And then when you leave that block, it'll automatically close it. And it's just super easy and much easier to use. And I almost always use it, but didn't use it at all in this talk. Then to load it, we just say, okay, now this config file that we just opened, pass it to json.load, and it will load that into a dictionary, because JSON maps very closely to Python dictionaries. In a lot of cases, you can even just take a JSON string and eval it, and it will mostly work. But you shouldn't do that because, well, you just shouldn't do that. So the load will parse it properly and actually cover all your bases and make sure someone didn't like connect to a SQL database and drop all your tables. There's also json.loads, which is probably the much more commonly used one. It's when you already have a string and you want to parse it. This one you can pass it a file object, it'll just read that all into a string and then parse it for you. So we parse everything that was in that config file and put it onto the config object, config dictionary. And then we will pull off all of them because config is just a regular Python dictionary. In this case, I actually did follow some best practices, good practices, and used get instead of just key indexing, so that if the JSON file didn't have the key that we were looking for, we'll just use one of these defaults. There is a JSON file that's living in there, but it has all the values that are actually just those defaults there, so not terribly exciting. But if you notice the last two lines there, they're just strings, but they're called path, which gives you a hint what they're going to be used for. And we do file reading. So when you have a file object, it is just it can be iterated over. And what it'll do is it'll iterate. Every iteration, it will return you a line from that file, and then you can iterate over it like that. So in here, we're building these question and answer dictionaries in a list comprehension, where we just iterate over the open files and store that line into the list. It's, again, I'm not closing these files, but they're anonymous, so hopefully the garbage collector will clean up after me, because I didn't clean up after myself, which you should all do, and don't follow my bad practices, only follow my good practices. Even though the garbage collector will probably be fine. So for the actual bot that I wrote, I went to the Zen of Python, PEP 20, I think it's 20. Took a bunch of lines and replaced some of the words with just a bunch of underscores, 5 underscores. So that's the file that our bot is going to read, and it'll be the black cards in Cards Against Humanity, or questions. And for the answers, I just went to the Python glossary and took every word out of it and shoved it into a file. So this is some of them. It's not all of them. There's 64 words in the glossary or something. So I'm not saying that this is going to be as fun to play as Cards Against Humanity, but someone who's wittier than me can probably go write better files. So for this section, we're not going to introduce anything new from the standard library, but it is going to kind of go over reusing all of the things we've talked about before to see how you actually build the logic. So this takes the private message. So once we have the IRC message, we will pass that in, and if that started with an exclamation point, we'll strip that off and pass it in here, and we say, okay, now this is a bot message. Right here where it says if message starts with, it's like, okay, we want to deal with this. Then we say if there's a space in it, because you could or could not have arguments. And if you try to split on a thing that isn't there and then unpack it automatically, it won't like you. So I say if there's a space, then we'll split on it. If there isn't a space, then we'll just treat the whole thing as the command. And then similar to how we dealt with the IRC message, we're going to have a handler, which just takes this command, or a dictionary of handlers, which just takes this command, grabs the function out of the dictionary by that key, and calls it. For the starting of the game, which is one of the commands, you can say exclamation point start. We'll just kind of create a dictionary, and it will keep track of the state of the game so that as things go on, we can know what's going on, we know when things have to happen. Time.time will return you the seconds since epoch, which is January 1st, 1970, UTC. And it's kind of weird, but that's just what Unix did. So we're going to use that. The useful thing is that if you take the time.time at any point, you'll have some seconds. Then at some point in the future, you can subtract that from the time you have now, and you'll have some number of seconds in between. I casted time.time to an int because on Unix and most operating systems, it'll return a floating point number with some extra precision that I didn't really care about. It wasn't necessary, but it was when I was debugging, it was easier to see integers. And then players will be all of the players that have joined your game. Then the next thing it will say is, hey, let everyone know that now the game has started by sending a message to the channel. And the person who asked to start the game, we're just going to assume that they also wanted to join it. So we'll call the player.join with them. And then there it is. You can see the bot said, hey, to start a game, type start. So I did, and it said, hey, game started, first draw in 30 seconds, which you don't see in the string there because it didn't fit on my slide, but then it automatically joined. Here's the player join method that we just called. All it does is it creates a player, which in this case is just a dictionary, sets your score to 0, creates a list of all of your cards using this getCard method. Then it will set your name in the dictionary of players on the game state as the key, and then that dictionary we just created as the value. It will send a message to the channel saying that this person has joined so that you know that everything worked. Then it will send a private message to you, because there, instead of sending the message to the channel, it sends it into the channel. It'll send it to the source, which is the person who called it, saying your cards are, and then it will enumerate over your hand. Enumerate is nifty because it returns a tuple of the index and the value, as opposed to when you just iterate over a list, it will just return the value. The reason we want the index is because that is how players will decide when the question comes out they will send a message saying, hey, I choose number 3 of my cards, so that no one else can see what's going on. And so there it is. I joined the game, and in my private messages, I see some of those things. So there, like 2 to 3 reference count, statement, descriptor. So like I said, I'm not terribly witty, but it's a Python conference. The last, not to say that Python people aren't witty, which I realize that could have come across as, I meant it's a Python conference, so I just used Python terms, and I'm not witty, but I'm sure every single one of you are. I'm sorry. So the last module that we're going to actually talk about is the random module. In most cases, in a lot of languages, the random module is kind of a random package. Just kind of says, hey, I'm going to return you some random integer, or in some cases, they'll also return you a number between a floating point number between 0 and 1. Which really is all of the random stuff it's based on. But Python goes a little farther and gives you a bunch of extra things. You can change the distribution of the random number that you get back. Or for our case, the super useful thing is that it has some special random actions that you can take on sequences. One of which is shuffle, which is pretty aptly named since we're dealing with an abstraction of a card game. So what we'll do is we'll say this questions deck, just shuffle it. And then the answers deck will just shuffle it. What shuffle does is it takes a list and replaces and moves all the elements around in place. So you say, here's the list, go shuffle it. And it won't return anything, but that list is now shuffled. Completely change the order of everything. Then, because this is now shuffled, we can just use pop, and it will return us one element off the end of the list, which is basically the same thing as drawing a card off the top of a deck. So that worked super well for a card game. The other one that is useful for us in this case is called random.choice. You pass it a sequence, and it will randomly choose one thing out of the list and return that value to you. So that's what we do whenever we start a game or start a round. We will randomly choose one player of the people that have joined and said, okay, you're the person that's drawing the black card now, mostly so that I could illustrate random.choice. Instead of keeping a list of everyone and going evenly. It's close enough to uniform, so it'll be close. And then the question, we'll just do the same thing we did for the hands and just draw one off the top of the questions deck. So there were no more modules I needed from the standard library to finish this off. So we still need to do a couple little things. Now that we've set up all of those different things we can do, we have this tick function, which we call every second in that while loop that just sits and waits. So it'll check to see what the time is. If the time is greater than, or if the time we next need to act is greater than what currently is now, then we will do something. If not, we will return. So it's saying, hey, the next action time is sometime in the future, so we're going to skip doing anything right now. Otherwise, it's going to say, what's the next action I need to do? In this case, if it's draw, we do the thing where it's, we randomly choose the player that we already saw, draw the card, set the active player, set all the choices list, ready for the game, the round to start. Send a message to everyone, letting everyone know what's going to happen, and say in 15 minutes, everyone will have to have chosen. It went really fast because I was testing and didn't want to wait like 5 minutes between rounds. And then we'll say, okay, now it's time for the chooser to choose. So it'll go through all of the choices, and that happens when choices get populated when a player actually says, okay, I choose number 1 of my hand. It would put it into this thing here. If no one had chose anything, it will say, hey, no one chose anything. Go back to draw and do it right now so we don't wait. Otherwise, it will shuffle the choices, and then it will iterate over all of them, spitting out an index for the chooser to choose, using string replacement to take the choice that they had chosen and put it in the string. So it'll list a whole bunch of things. Oh, I didn't have a picture, but there were some funny ones, like, I don't remember now. Two of the questions actually sometimes were funny. The one like, blank or a honking good idea, let's do more of that. And you could have things like Guido. I don't remember. But I thought I had a screenshot, but I didn't do it. But that's really all there is to it. We didn't use any third-party modules, and that kind of covers everything. I kind of ran over it pretty quickly, but all of the code is up on GitHub. And I think there's a PyDX channel on Freenode, so I could even connect the bot to that, show you that it does actually work. There are quite a few improvements could have made. Like I mentioned, the one like didn't close my file handles. I didn't deal with exceptions at all. And there's a lot, when you're dealing with user input, you should always be handling your exceptions. So other things you could have used even in the STDLIB in this project, there's the sys, so you could have passed in arguments on the command line to change the configuration. If you wanted to have something where you like stored those games so other people could search them in the future, so you wouldn't do like I did and just forget all of the options and things people had chosen before, that would be there. There's also URL lib2, HTTP lib, lots of things like that for trying to deal with HTTP requests. Also, if you wanted to change this into like a website, you could use base HTTP server. But with both of those last options, the main point to bring up is that you shouldn't use the standard library, at least not by itself. Python has an amazing amount of third-party libraries. All of the things that I mentioned before, like instead of manually creating and talking over sockets, you can just use an IRC library. It exists, pip install IRC. Now you have a client and you don't have to deal with all the sockets that I did. Instead of using sys to get your argument values, or you can use click. Click is a pretty neat little library for building command line tools. I think everyone knows that you should just use requests instead of trying to use HTTP lib or URL lib or URL lib2 or URL parse or URL parse2. You just use requests. And then instead of trying to use the base HTTP server or simple HTTP server, you can just use Django or Flask. There's a lot of really good things out there in the third-party module system. Standard library is great. The trick is kind of knowing when you want to use one or the other. You kind of never want to be like, okay, I'm only going to use the standard library, or only ever just try to find a tool that already does it. Sometimes you just want to get something up and running fast, and for that you can just use standard library. You start to get into something complicated like trying to talk to an IRC server over sockets, you can just look something up and it's probably there for you. Thanks. Whichever. If people want to know, they can ask me questions if they want. Or they can. You can either ask me questions, or if you're afraid, I can, or just embarrassed, or for whatever reason, you can write on a card. What standard library features the other languages that you work with you wish Python had built in? And can you repeat it? Sure. So he asked what features of other languages that I work with do I wish that Python had built in. I like channels in Go a whole bunch, and Go routines. Go routines kind of work. There's third-party libraries in most cases to do that. JavaScript, or Node in particular, has the concept of streams. That's super useful. Maybe you may have noticed that those three things were all kind of concurrency and parallel oriented. Python does not have a great story for that, even though the threading module is there and nice, and we have third-party libraries. It's not super good. In C, I use the standard templating library a whole bunch. That's not super useful in Python because we're not all statically typed. But yeah. There's mostly I wish Python had a better concurrency and parallelization story. Okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. What's up? Yes. Well, so not inside the comprehension, but you would do the with for the context manager and then do the list comprehension inside of it. So you'd say with, open this as my file, and then you'd build the list inside of that. And then it would definitely have cleaned up after itself when it exited that block. Pardon? Possibly. I may have forgotten to make it public. I will do that right after this talk. So yeah, Cards Against Humanity definitely would be a code of conduct violation. But I just showed you the questions and the answers there. That I don't think would be a code of conduct violation. Some of those answers are a little risky too. Hashable interface generator. So maybe it won't get to go into Freenode. We'll see. Okay, thanks.